Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's talk about a young Marine who walked into his commander's office and confessed to espionage. On the afternoon of December 14th, 1986, Clayton Joel Lonetree, a 25-year-old sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, sat in a small office at the American Embassy in Vienna, Austria, across a desk from Gunnery Sergeant Mark Johnson, the Marine Security Guard Detachment Commander. The office was located on the third floor of the embassy building, a modern structure on Boltzmanngasse in Vienna's 9th district. Outside, the winter sky was overcast, and the temperature hovered just above freezing. Inside, the fluorescent lighting cast a harsh institutional glow over the government-issue furniture and beige walls. Lonetree had requested this meeting 2 days earlier, telling Johnson only that he needed to discuss something important. Johnson had assumed it might be a personal matter, perhaps a request for leave or a complaint about duty assignments. What Lonetree was about to reveal would instead trigger one of the most significant counterintelligence investigations of the late Cold War period and expose vulnerabilities in how the United States protected its diplomatic facilities from foreign intelligence penetration. Lonetree had arrived at the Vienna embassy only 6 weeks earlier, transferred from his previous posting at the American Embassy in Moscow, where he had served from September 1984 to October 1986. According to Marine Corps records, his 2 years in Moscow had been unremarkable from an official perspective. His performance evaluations had been satisfactory, noting him as a competent and reliable guard who fulfilled his duties without incident. He had received no disciplinary actions and no particular commendations. To his superiors, he had appeared to be exactly what he was supposed to be: a young Marine doing his job protecting American diplomatic facilities and personnel in a hostile foreign capital. What Lonetree told Gunnery Sergeant Johnson that December afternoon would reveal that this appearance of normalcy had been entirely misleading. According to Johnson's subsequent report, Lonetree appeared nervous and struggled to articulate what he wanted to say. He fidgeted with his hands, looked down at the desk rather than making eye contact, and spoke haltingly. Finally, he said that during his time in Moscow, he had developed a relationship with a Soviet woman who worked at the American Embassy, and that through this relationship, he had been contacted by Soviet intelligence officers. He said he had provided information to these officers and that he wanted to report what had happened because he felt guilty and believed it was the right thing to do. Johnson's immediate response, as documented in his report, was disbelief followed by alarm. He instructed Lonetree to remain in the office and immediately contacted the embassy's regional security officer. Within hours, Lonetree was being interviewed by both the regional security officer and representatives from the Naval Investigative Service, the military agency responsible for investigating crimes involving Navy and Marine Corps personnel. These initial interviews would continue for several days and would establish the basic outline of what had occurred in Moscow, though the full extent and consequences of Lonetree's actions would only emerge through months of subsequent investigation. Clayton Lonetree had been born on June 15, 1961, in St. Paul, Minnesota. His background was complex and would later be cited by both prosecution and defense attorneys as relevant to understanding his vulnerability to recruitment. His father, Spencer Lonetree, was a member of the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, and his mother, Sally Sosi, was Navajo. His parents had separated when he was young, and he had been raised primarily by his mother on the Navajo Nation Reservation near Sweetwater, Arizona. According to family members and teachers interviewed years later, Clayton had grown up feeling caught between different worlds, not fully belonging either to reservation life or to mainstream American society. He had attended high school at St. Michael Indian School on the Navajo Reservation, graduating in 1979. His academic record was average, though teachers noted he was quiet and kept largely to himself. After graduation, facing limited economic opportunities on the reservation, he had enlisted in the Marine Corps in August 1980 at the age of 19. The decision to join the military was not unusual for young Native Americans facing economic challenges. The armed forces offered steady employment, training, and a sense of purpose that could be difficult to find elsewhere. Lonetree's Marine Corps basic training took place at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, California. He completed the training without particular distinction, but without problems, graduating in November 1980. He was then assigned to Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in California, where he served as a supply clerk. According to his service records, he was considered a satisfactory Marine, neither exceptional nor problematic. He followed orders, showed up for duty on time, and caused no disciplinary issues. In 1983, at the age of 22, Lonetree volunteered for the Marine Security Guard program, which assigned Marines to guard American embassies and consulates around the world. The MSG program was considered a desirable assignment for young Marines. It offered the opportunity to travel, to serve in an important security role, and to earn extra pay. The selection process was competitive, requiring security clearances, psychological evaluations, and interviews. Candidates needed to demonstrate reliability, discretion, and the ability to maintain professional behavior in sometimes difficult circumstances. Lonetree successfully completed the MSG training program at the Marine Corps Security Guard School in Quantico, Virginia, in early 1984. The training included instruction in diplomatic security procedures, recognition of surveillance techniques, awareness of foreign intelligence threats, and protocols for protecting classified information. Marines assigned to embassies in communist countries received additional briefings emphasizing the aggressive intelligence collection efforts of Soviet bloc services and the methods these services used to recruit American personnel. These briefings explicitly warned about romantic or sexual approaches, attempts to compromise Americans through blackmail, appeals to ideology or sympathy for the host country, and the offer of money or other inducements. In September 1984, at the age of 23, Lonetree arrived in Moscow for his first embassy posting. The American embassy in Moscow at that time was located on Tchaikovsky Street, an imposing building with a distinctive modernist design that had been completed in the early 1950s. The embassy was, by definition, hostile territory. Every American working there operated under the assumption that the building was thoroughly penetrated by Soviet intelligence through electronic surveillance devices, that Soviet employees working at the embassy were intelligence assets or agents, and that Americans would be subjected to surveillance and recruitment attempts whenever they left the compound. The Marine security guards lived in a residential building separate from the main embassy, sharing apartments and maintaining a duty rotation that provided 24-hour security. Their primary responsibilities included controlling access to the embassy, monitoring security systems, protecting classified materials, and responding to emergencies. Marines were explicitly forbidden from fraternizing with Soviet citizens or allowing Soviet nationals into the secure areas of the embassy where classified information was stored and processed. According to Lonetree's later testimony during investigation interviews and court proceedings, his first several months in Moscow were uneventful. He stood his posts, participated in the duty rotation, and adjusted to life in the Soviet capital. The work was often tedious, long shifts monitoring access points, checking identification, making rounds through the embassy. The social life was limited. Marines were discouraged from venturing into Moscow alone and were warned repeatedly about the dangers of establishing any personal relationships with Soviets. But Moscow, even during the Cold War, was a city with social spaces where foreigners and Soviets could interact under controlled conditions. There were diplomatic receptions, cultural events at the embassy, and approved restaurants and clubs where foreigners were permitted. The Soviet government maintained strict control over which Soviet citizens could have contact with foreigners, carefully managing these interactions through organizations like the Soviet Peace Committee and the Union of Friendship Societies. In February 1985, approximately 5 months after his arrival in Moscow, Lonetree met Violetta Alexandrovna Seina at a diplomatic reception held at the American Embassy. Seina was a 24-year-old woman who worked as a translator at the embassy, employed through the Soviet government's official hiring process for Soviet nationals working at foreign diplomatic missions. Like all Soviet employees at Western embassies, she would have been thoroughly vetted by Soviet security services and would have been operating under their oversight and control. According to Lonetree's testimony, Seina approached him during the reception and initiated conversation. She spoke excellent English, was attractive, and showed apparent interest in him. They talked for perhaps 20 minutes that first evening, discussing general topics: where he was from, how he was adjusting to Moscow, what he thought of the city. The conversation was pleasant but unremarkable, and when the reception ended, they parted without making any specific plans to meet again. But in the following weeks, Lonetree began seeing Seina regularly at the embassy during his duty shifts. The translator's office was in an area where Marines had legitimate access, and according to Lonetree's account, Seina would sometimes stop to talk with him when their paths crossed. These conversations gradually became more personal. She asked about his background, his family, his life in America. He found himself looking forward to these encounters and began timing his movements through the embassy to increase the likelihood of seeing her. By April 1985, according to Lonetree's testimony, the relationship had progressed beyond casual conversation. Seina suggested they meet outside the embassy, and Lonetree agreed, despite knowing this violated the prohibitions against fraternizing with Soviet citizens. They began meeting at various locations in Moscow: parks, cafes, restaurants. Seina would give Lonetree the time and place for these meetings, always choosing locations and times that presumably allowed Soviet intelligence to monitor the encounters without Lonetree's awareness. The relationship developed, according to Lonetree's account, into a romantic and sexual one. Seina told him she cared for him and suggested that perhaps they might have a future together. For Lonetree, who by his own later admission had felt isolated and lonely in Moscow, the relationship provided emotional connection and validation. He would later testify that he believed Seina's feelings were genuine and that he had fallen in love with her. What Lonetree either did not recognize or chose not to acknowledge was that the relationship was almost certainly orchestrated from the beginning by Soviet intelligence. Violetta Seina's employment at the American Embassy, her access to Marines and other embassy personnel, her attractive appearance and facility with English, and her apparent willingness to risk meeting secretly with an American all suggested that she was functioning as what intelligence professionals call a swallow, an agent tasked with developing romantic or sexual relationships to compromise foreign targets. In June 1985, approximately 4 months after meeting Seina, Lonetree was introduced to a man Seina identified as her uncle Sasha, Alexei, a middle-aged Soviet citizen who Seina said was concerned about her welfare and wanted to meet the American she had been spending time with. The meeting took place at a Moscow restaurant. According to Lonetree's testimony, Uncle Sasha was friendly and asked questions about Lonetree's life and work. The conversation seemed innocuous, focused on getting to know each other rather than on anything sensitive or suspicious. But in subsequent meetings over the summer of 1985, Uncle Sasha, whose real name was Alexei Yefimov, and who was, according to CIA analysis, a case officer with the KGB's second chief directorate responsible for counterintelligence and internal security, gradually steered conversations toward Lonetree's work at the embassy. According to Lonetree's later testimony, Yefimov would ask general questions. How was security at the embassy? What were Lonetree's duties? What parts of the embassy did he have access to? The questions were posed in a casual, conversational manner that did not immediately signal recruitment. Then, in August 1985, during a meeting at Yefimov's apartment, arranged, Yefimov had said, so they could speak more privately, Yefimov made the recruitment pitch explicit. According to Lonetree's account, Yefimov explained that he worked for Soviet security services and that he believed the Cold War tensions between the United States and Soviet Union were dangerous. He suggested that better understanding between the two countries could reduce the risk of conflict. He said that Americans and Soviets who wanted peace needed to work together, even if their governments were in opposition. He asked Lonetree if he would be willing to help by providing information that might help Soviet officials better understand American policies and intentions. The pitch was framed not as espionage or betrayal, but as contribution to peace and mutual understanding. This approach, appealing to higher ideals rather than to greed or base motives, was standard Soviet recruitment tradecraft, particularly effective with younger, idealistic targets who could be convinced they were serving a greater good rather than committing treason. Lonetree agreed. According to his later testimony, he did so primarily because he believed it would help maintain his relationship with Violetta Seina, whom he still believed loved him and whose uncle was making the request. He would later acknowledge that he also found the idea of being valued and trusted by Soviet intelligence appealing. It made him feel important and special in ways his routine work as a Marine Guard did not. The information Lonetree initially provided was, according to his account, relatively minor. The names and positions of certain embassy personnel, the physical layout of parts of the embassy, information about security procedures and shift schedules for the Marine Guards. Yefimov would ask questions, Lonetree would answer, and Yefimov would sometimes provide small amounts of cash, a few hundred rubles at a time, as payment and recognition. But over the following months, from late summer 1985 through the spring of 1986, the requests became more specific and more serious. Yefimov asked Lonetree to provide floor plans of the embassy's secure areas, information about communications equipment, and details about classified document storage procedures. According to subsequent damage assessments, some of the information Lonetree provided could have allowed Soviet intelligence to better target electronic surveillance efforts, to identify Americans who might be intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, and to understand vulnerabilities in the embassy's security. Lonetree would later claim that he never provided classified documents themselves, only information about embassy operations and personnel. However, his access as a Marine Guard was considerable. Marines had keys to virtually every room in the embassy, had knowledge of alarm codes and security protocols, and could observe the comings and goings of everyone in the building. Even without providing documents, Lonetree's cooperation gave Soviet intelligence operational advantages. The relationship with Violetta Seina continued throughout this period, though Lonetree would later testify that he saw her less frequently after the recruitment by Yefimov began. When they did meet, she would often ask how things were going with her uncle and would encourage Lonetree to continue cooperating. The romantic relationship appeared increasingly to serve the purpose of maintaining Lonetree's motivation to work with Soviet intelligence. In June 1986, Lonetree was informed that his posting in Moscow would end in October and that he would be transferred to Vienna. This was part of the normal rotation for Marine security guards, who typically served 2-year tours at any given embassy. According to his testimony, when he informed Yefimov of the impending transfer, the KGB officer told him this was actually good news, that Lonetree would continue working with Soviet intelligence in Vienna, where he would be contacted by other officers. Lonetree's last meeting with Violetta Seina occurred in September 1986, shortly before his departure from Moscow. According to his account, Seina told him she loved him and hoped they might somehow be together in the future, though she acknowledged the difficulties given the geopolitical situation. Lonetree would later testify that he believed her and that leaving Moscow meant leaving behind someone he loved. Lonetree arrived at the American Embassy in Vienna in October 1986. Vienna, unlike Moscow, was not behind the Iron Curtain. Austria was a neutral country where East and West maintained diplomatic presence and where intelligence services from both sides operated with somewhat less restriction than in their home capitals. The American embassy was located in a relatively open environment compared to Moscow's hostile atmosphere. According to Lonetree's testimony, he was contacted in Vienna within 2 weeks of his arrival. A man who identified himself as a Soviet diplomat left a message at the embassy asking Lonetree to call him. When Lonetree did so, the man, later identified as Georgy Bezverkov, a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover, arranged a meeting at a Vienna restaurant. At this meeting, Bezverkov informed Lonetree that he was aware of Lonetree's cooperation with Soviet intelligence in Moscow and that this cooperation would now continue in Vienna. The tone, according to Lonetree's account, was less friendly than his interactions with Yefimov had been. Bezverkov made clear that Lonetree had already crossed lines that could not be uncrossed, that Soviet intelligence had documentation of his cooperation, and that any attempt to stop working with them would result in exposure of what he had already done. The implicit threat was obvious. Continue cooperating or face ruin. Lonetree had entered Vienna believing he might somehow extricate himself from the situation, but Bezverkov's approach made clear that Soviet intelligence viewed him as a controlled asset, not a willing partner. The relationship had shifted from one that Lonetree could rationalize as contribution to peace to one that was clearly coercive. Lonetree met with Bezverkov 3 times between late October and early December 1986. According to his testimony, Bezverkov asked for information similar to what Yefimov had requested in Moscow: details about embassy security, information about personnel, floor plans, and access procedures. At their 3rd meeting, held at a Vienna coffeehouse on December 9th, Bezverkov pressed Lonetree for more specific intelligence about communications systems and asked him to photograph certain areas of the embassy during his duty shifts. Lonetree provided some information, but felt increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. In Vienna, away from Violetta Seina and the emotional justifications he had constructed for his cooperation, the reality of what he was doing became more difficult to rationalize. He was no longer helping promote peace or maintaining a relationship with someone he loved. He was simply being used by a foreign intelligence service that viewed him as an exploitable asset. The meetings with Bezverkov left him feeling anxious and trapped. He began having difficulty sleeping, experienced stomach problems that he attributed to stress, and found it harder to concentrate on his duties. During the second week of December 1986, Lonetree experienced what he would later describe as a crisis of conscience. He had been feeling guilty and anxious since arriving in Vienna, and the pressure of maintaining the deception while serving as a Marine guard, sworn to protect the very embassy he was compromising, became overwhelming. He spent hours alone in his quarters, wrestling with what to do. The rational choice was obvious: continue cooperating to avoid exposure and prosecution. But the weight of the deception had become unbearable. On December 12th, he made the decision to report what had happened. He approached Gunnery Sergeant Johnson on December 14, 1986, and requested the meeting that would begin the unraveling of the entire operation. The initial interviews with Lonetree, conducted by the embassy's regional security officer and Naval Investigative Service agents over several days in mid-December, established the basic facts of his recruitment and cooperation with Soviet intelligence. Lonetree appeared, according to investigators' reports, to be genuinely remorseful and cooperative. He answered questions without attempting to minimize his actions, provided names and details of his contacts with Yefimov and Bezverkov, and described the information he had provided. However, as the investigation deepened, significant inconsistencies and gaps emerged in Lonetree's account. Most critically, investigators became concerned that Lonetree might have provided Soviet intelligence with physical access to the embassy's most secure areas, specifically the communications center where classified messages were processed and the areas where the most sensitive diplomatic and intelligence materials were stored. On December 20, 1986, Lonetree was placed in restrictive custody at the embassy, and his access to classified areas was revoked. Naval Investigative Service agents continued intensive interviews, and on December 23rd, Lonetree was flown from Vienna to the United States under escort. He was taken to Marine Corps Air Station Quantico in Virginia, where he was held in the brig, military detention, while the investigation continued. The arrival of Lonetree at Quantico triggered a massive counterintelligence effort involving the Naval Investigative Service, the FBI, the CIA, and the State Department. The immediate concern was determining exactly what damage had been done. Had Lonetree simply provided the information he described, or had he done more? Had he allowed Soviet intelligence officers physical access to secure areas? Had classified documents been compromised? Were other Marines similarly compromised? Technical teams were dispatched to both the Moscow and Vienna embassies to conduct sweeps for electronic surveillance devices. The CIA's Soviet division began analyzing what information about American operations in Moscow might have been compromised. The State Department initiated damage assessments to determine what diplomatic equities might be at risk. The Marine Corps began reviewing its entire MSG program to identify systemic vulnerabilities. Lonetree's interrogations at Quantico continued through January and February of 1987. According to transcripts of these sessions, investigators repeatedly pressed him about whether he had allowed Soviet intelligence officers into secure areas of the Moscow embassy. Lonetree initially denied this, maintaining that he had only provided information through conversation and had never compromised physical security. But on January 12, 1987, during his 14th day of intensive questioning, Lonetree altered his account. According to the interrogation log, he admitted that on at least 2 occasions in late 1985 he had allowed Yefimov to enter the Moscow embassy through a service entrance during the overnight shift when Lonetree was the duty Marine. Lonetree stated that Yefimov had told him he only wanted to photograph certain unclassified areas of the embassy for architectural purposes, and that Lonetree had escorted Yefimov through non-secure corridors for approximately 15 minutes on each occasion before letting him back out through the same entrance. This admission transformed the investigation's assessment of the damage. If Yefimov had been inside the embassy, even in supposedly non-secure areas, he could have planted electronic surveillance devices, photographed areas beyond where Lonetree escorted him, or gained intelligence about the embassy's layout that would facilitate future penetration efforts. The idea that a KGB officer had been physically inside the American embassy in Moscow with the cooperation of a Marine Guard was a profound security breach. However, over the following weeks, Lonetree recanted this admission. He told investigators that he had been exhausted from the constant interrogation, confused, and under psychological pressure, and that he had told them what he thought they wanted to hear. He insisted that he had never allowed anyone into the embassy and that his original account was accurate. This recantation created significant problems for investigators and would become a central issue at his trial. While Lonetree's interrogations continued, the investigation expanded in other directions. One development involved another Marine security guard who had served in Moscow, Corporal Arnold Bracey, who had been part of the MSG detachment during the same period as Lonetree. Based partly on information from Lonetree's interrogations and partly on independent investigation, Bracey was suspected of also being compromised by Soviet intelligence. On May 21, 1987, Bracey was arrested and charged with espionage-related offenses similar to those Lonetree faced. According to the charges, Bracey had allegedly allowed Soviet intelligence officers to enter the Moscow embassy and had provided information about security procedures in exchange for sexual favors arranged by Soviet intelligence. The allegations suggested a pattern that the KGB had systematically targeted multiple young Marines at the Moscow embassy, exploiting their isolation and vulnerabilities. However, the evidence against Bracey proved far weaker than the case against Lonetree. Bracey adamantly denied all allegations. There was no documentation of meetings with Soviet intelligence officers, no evidence of payments, and no confession. The case against him appeared to rest primarily on circumstantial evidence and on disputed statements from Lonetree's interrogations that Lonetree himself later claimed were unreliable. As the Bracey case developed, serious questions emerged about investigative overreach. Some of the interrogation techniques used with both Marines came under scrutiny. Defense attorneys argued that young, unsophisticated service members had been subjected to psychological pressure that produced unreliable statements. The Naval Investigative Service defended its methods, but acknowledged that some procedures might have been more aggressive than necessary. On August 24, 1987, all charges against Arnold Bracey were dropped when prosecutors determined the evidence was insufficient to sustain a conviction. The Marine Corps issued a statement saying the decision reflected the interests of justice and that Bracey would return to duty. This development was embarrassing for investigators and raised questions about whether the Lonetree case had been handled appropriately. If one Marine had been wrongly accused based on flawed evidence, what did that suggest about the reliability of evidence against Lonetree? On March 28, 1987, Clayton Lonetree was formally charged under the Uniform Code of Military Justice with espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, disclosure of classified information, and other offenses. The charges carried potential sentences up to life imprisonment. The case was assigned to a general court-martial, the military justice system's equivalent of a civilian felony trial, to be held at Marine Corps Base Quantico. Clayton Lonetree's court-martial began on July 21, 1987, at Marine Corps Base Quantico. The proceedings were held in a courtroom normally used for lesser military justice matters, but specially configured for this high-profile case. The judge was Colonel William Kunhart, an experienced military justice officer. The prosecution was led by Major John Daniel, assisted by a team of military lawyers with security clearances that allowed them to handle classified information. Lonetree's defense was led by Captain Michael Powell, a military defense attorney, and William Kunstler, a prominent civilian defense attorney known for taking controversial cases. The trial lasted 4 weeks and involved testimony from more than 50 witnesses, including Naval Investigative Service agents who had interrogated Lonetree, embassy personnel who had observed his behavior in Moscow, technical experts who assessed the damage from his compromise, and Lonetree himself. The prosecution's case rested on several pillars. First, Lonetree's own admissions, setting aside the disputed question of whether he had allowed physical access to the embassy, that he had provided information about embassy operations, security procedures, and personnel to Soviet intelligence. Prosecutors presented detailed timelines of Lonetree's meetings with Yefimov and Bezverkov, supported by his own statements made during the initial Vienna interviews before any alleged coercion occurred. Second, testimony from embassy staff about his relationship with Violetta Seina and his violations of prohibitions against fraternizing with Soviet nationals. Several Marines testified that they had seen Lonetree leaving the embassy at unusual times and had heard him mention meeting a Russian woman, though none had reported these observations at the time. Third, evidence of cash payments Lonetree had received from his Soviet handlers. Financial records showed deposits to Lonetree's account that could not be explained by his military salary, and Lonetree himself had admitted receiving money from Yefimov, though he claimed the amounts were small. Fourth, expert testimony about the potential damage from the information he had provided. A CIA analyst testified that the floor plans and security information Lonetree provided would have allowed Soviet intelligence to better target collection efforts and could have compromised the security of American personnel working at the embassy. A Marine Corps security expert testified that Lonetree's knowledge of guard schedules, access codes, and surveillance detection procedures would have been extremely valuable to hostile intelligence services. The defense strategy had 2 main components. First, defense attorneys argued that Lonetree had been naive and manipulated, that he had fallen in love with Seina and had been expertly recruited through that relationship by sophisticated intelligence professionals. They emphasized his youth, his relative lack of sophistication, and his cultural background as a Native American who may have felt marginalized and thus particularly vulnerable to recruitment approaches that made him feel valued. William Kunstler, in his opening statement, painted a picture of a young man far from home, lonely, targeted by professionals who knew exactly how to exploit his vulnerabilities. He described the KGB's recruitment operation as a textbook case of manipulation. They found his weakness. They exploited it, and when he tried to resist, they trapped him. Second, they challenged the interrogation methods used to obtain Lonetree's confession, arguing that he had been psychologically coerced and that some of his admissions, particularly about allowing physical access to the embassy, were unreliable. Defense attorneys called a psychologist who testified about the effects of prolonged interrogation on young adults and suggested that Lonetree's confession about allowing Yefimov into the embassy had been the product of mental exhaustion and desire to please his interrogators rather than actual memory. Lonetree himself testified for several days. According to courtroom observers, he appeared remorseful and at times tearful. He acknowledged that he had violated his oath and betrayed his duties as a Marine. He testified that he had genuinely believed he loved Violetta Seina and that his relationship with her had clouded his judgment. He described the progression of the recruitment in detail, explaining how Yefimov had gradually made him feel that what he was doing was helping peace rather than harming his country. When cross-examined by prosecutors about specific information he had provided, Lonetree admitted to giving details about embassy personnel, floor layouts, and security procedures, but insisted he had refused to provide certain information he considered too sensitive. When asked why he had not reported the recruitment attempt when Yefimov first approached him, Lonetree said, "I thought I could manage it. I thought I could keep seeing Violetta without really hurting anything. I was wrong." The most dramatic moment of the trial came when prosecutors played a videotape of Lonetree's January 12th interrogation session in which he had admitted to allowing Yefimov into the embassy. In the video, Lonetree appeared exhausted. His voice was flat, and he seemed to struggle to form coherent sentences. Defense attorneys used this video to support their argument about coercion, while prosecutors argued it simply showed a guilty man finally telling the truth after weeks of denial. On August 21, 1987, the military jury, called a panel in court-martial proceedings, deliberated for approximately 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on nearly all charges. Lonetree was found guilty of espionage, conspiracy, disclosing classified information to Soviet intelligence, fraternizing with a foreign national, and several lesser offenses. He was acquitted on charges related to allowing physical access to the embassy, with the panel apparently finding that the evidence on this point was insufficient or unreliable given Lonetree's recantation and the questionable interrogation circumstances. The sentencing phase of the trial began immediately. The prosecution argued for a sentence of life imprisonment, emphasizing the seriousness of espionage, the damage to national security, and the need to deter other service members from similar betrayals. Major Daniel told the panel, "Sergeant Lonetree had a sacred duty to protect American secrets and American lives. He betrayed that duty for money and for a relationship with a woman who was using him. The damage he caused may never be fully known, but what is known is serious enough to warrant the maximum penalty." The defense argued for leniency based on Lonetree's cooperation, his genuine remorse, his youth and vulnerability to manipulation, and the fact that the most serious allegations, allowing physical access, had not been proven. William Kunstler delivered an impassioned plea, arguing that Clayton Lonetree was a victim before he became a perpetrator. The system that put a 23-year-old from the Navajo reservation into the most hostile intelligence environment in the world without adequate preparation or support shares responsibility for what happened. On August 24, 1987, the panel sentenced Lonetree to 30 years in prison, reduction in rank to private, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a dishonorable discharge from the Marine Corps. The sentence was less than the life imprisonment the prosecution had sought, but was still among the longest prison terms imposed in military espionage cases up to that time. Under military justice procedures, Lonetree's conviction and sentence were subject to several levels of review. The commanding general of Marine Corps Base Quantico reviewed the case and could have reduced the sentence but chose not to. The case then went to the Navy Marine Corps Court of Military Review, which in 1988 upheld the conviction but reduced the sentence to 25 years. The reasoning for the reduction was that certain evidence presented at trial had been prejudicial and that some of the sentencing testimony about damage assessments had been speculative rather than based on documented facts. In 1989, the case was reviewed by the U.S. Court of Military Appeals, the highest military appeals court. That court also upheld the conviction and the reduced 25-year sentence. Lonetree's attorneys then sought review by the U.S. Supreme Court, but the court declined to hear the case, allowing the military court's decision to stand. Clayton Lonetree was initially incarcerated at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the military prison that houses service members convicted of serious crimes. The facility, located on a bluff overlooking the Missouri River, had housed military prisoners since the late 1800s and was known for its harsh conditions and strict discipline. According to prison records and later interviews, Lonetree was a model prisoner. He caused no disciplinary problems, participated in educational programs offered at the facility, and expressed continued remorse for his actions. He completed courses in computer technology and business administration through correspondence programs. He maintained limited contact with family members, primarily through letters, as the distance from Arizona to Kansas made regular visits difficult for his mother. The impact of Lonetree's case on his family was profound and lasting. His mother, Sally Sosi, maintained that her son had been unfairly portrayed and that the punishment was excessively harsh for someone who had been manipulated. She visited him in prison when she could afford to make the trip from Arizona to Kansas, a journey of approximately 1,200 miles each way that required either a long drive or expensive flights. According to people who knew the family, the shame and stigma of having a son convicted of espionage affected Sally's standing in her community on the Navajo reservation, where military service was traditionally honored and respected. Some community members viewed Clayton's conviction as bringing dishonor not just to his family, but to Native Americans serving in the military more broadly. In 1996, after serving 9 years of his sentence, Lonetree became eligible for parole from military confinement. A parole board reviewed his case, considering his good behavior in prison, his continued expressions of remorse, the completion of educational programs, and arguments from his attorneys that he had been sufficiently punished. On February 27, 1996, at the age of 34, Clayton Lonetree was released from the military prison at Fort Leavenworth. However, his release from military custody did not mean freedom. Under the terms of his sentence, he remained on parole and was subject to various restrictions. He was required to report regularly to a parole officer, was prohibited from traveling outside designated areas without permission, could not work in positions requiring security clearances or handling of sensitive information, and was required to maintain steady employment. Lonetree returned to Minnesota after his release, settling in the St. Paul area, where he had been born. He worked various jobs, construction work, warehouse positions, retail, none of which paid particularly well or offered much opportunity for advancement. His dishonorable discharge from the Marine Corps meant he was ineligible for veterans' benefits, including educational assistance, health care through the Veterans Administration, or other support programs available to honorably discharged veterans. According to later interviews, Lonetree struggled with the transition to civilian life. He was now in his mid-30s, had spent 9 years in prison, had no marketable skills beyond his military training, and carried the stigma of being a convicted spy. He attempted to maintain a low profile, avoiding publicity and declining most interview requests. He married in the late 1990s, though according to public records, that marriage ended in divorce within a few years. Those who encountered him during this period described him as quiet, withdrawn, and carrying a visible weight of guilt and regret. The broader consequences of the Lonetree case extended far beyond his personal circumstances. The Marine Corps initiated a comprehensive review of the MSG program, implementing numerous security enhancements designed to prevent similar compromises. These changes included more rigorous psychological screening of candidates for the program, with particular attention to identifying individuals who might be vulnerable to recruitment, more frequent and thorough security reviews of Marines serving in embassies with mandatory polygraph examinations every 6 months, enhanced counterintelligence briefings before and during foreign assignments that included detailed case studies of how recruitment operations worked, stricter enforcement of rules against fraternization with foreign nationals, including explicit prohibitions on dating or socializing with citizens of hostile countries, implementation of buddy systems requiring Marines to account for each other's whereabouts during off-duty hours, more intensive screening of candidates for the program, including interviews with family members and community members to identify potential vulnerabilities, and increased rotation of Marines between posts to reduce the time available for foreign intelligence services to develop relationships. The State Department similarly overhauled security procedures at American embassies worldwide. Soviet nationals working at the Moscow embassy were banned from most areas of the facility, a decision that created diplomatic friction but was deemed necessary for security. Additional background checks were required for all local employees at embassies in communist countries. Technical security sweeps were increased in frequency. Physical security measures were enhanced, including installation of additional cameras and sensors. The Moscow embassy, in particular, underwent extensive modifications following the Lonetree case and related security concerns. Eventually, the decision was made to construct an entirely new embassy building in Moscow, a project completed in the early 2000s with security features specifically designed to address the vulnerabilities that cases like Lonetree's had exposed. The new facility eliminated most areas where Soviet nationals worked, implemented advanced electronic surveillance countermeasures, and created physical barriers that made unauthorized access virtually impossible. The Lonetree case also prompted broader discussions within the Department of Defense about the vulnerabilities of young military personnel assigned to foreign service. Several studies commissioned by the Pentagon examined why Lonetree and potentially other Marines had been vulnerable to recruitment. These studies identified several risk factors that would inform future security training. Youth and relative inexperience, making young service members more susceptible to manipulation, isolation, and loneliness during foreign assignments, creating emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited, lack of strong support systems when stationed far from home and familiar social networks, possible feelings of alienation or not belonging, particularly among minorities or those from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, and susceptibility to manipulation through romantic relationships, which Soviet intelligence specifically targeted as a recruitment vector. What emerged from these analyses was a recognition that while Lonetree bore personal responsibility for his choices, the systems designed to protect against such compromises had been inadequate. Young Marines, often in their early 20s with limited life experience, were being placed in high-pressure foreign environments, warned about threats, but not given adequate tools to recognize or resist sophisticated recruitment techniques, and expected to maintain perfect vigilance while also dealing with normal human needs for connection and validation. The reforms that followed Lonetree's case attempted to address these systemic vulnerabilities while still holding individuals accountable for their choices. For the Marine Corps, the Lonetree case became a cautionary tale used in security training for decades afterward. Marines assigned to embassy duty were shown Lonetree's story as an example of how recruitment operations worked, how ordinary vulnerabilities could be exploited, and what consequences followed from betraying one's oath. Training materials developed after the case included detailed scenarios based on Lonetree's recruitment, teaching young Marines to recognize the signs of a recruitment approach and emphasizing the importance of immediately reporting any suspicious contacts. The message was clear. This could happen to anyone who wasn't vigilant, and the consequences would be severe. The question of Violetta Seina's fate and true nature remained unknown. Soviet records that might have documented her role were not accessible to Western researchers during the Cold War. After the Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991, some KGB archives were partially open to researchers, but documents specific to active intelligence operations remained largely classified. Seina's identity was never conclusively verified. It may have been a cover name, and the woman Lonetree knew may have been one of several KGB assets using similar identities to target foreign personnel. Whether Seina was a willing KGB officer, a coerced informant pressured to cooperate with Soviet intelligence, or an agent who perhaps developed some genuine feelings for Lonetree even while fulfilling her assigned role, remained matters of speculation. The ultimate impact of Lonetree's espionage on American national security also remained somewhat ambiguous. The official damage assessments prepared by the Department of Defense and the CIA were classified, and only summaries were released publicly. These summaries indicated that Lonetree had compromised information about embassy security, personnel, and operations. The assessments concluded that while the compromise was serious, the most catastrophic scenarios, such as comprehensive compromise of classified communications or exposure of intelligence agents, had not occurred. Some intelligence analysts argued that Lonetree's cooperation had been damaging but not catastrophic, providing Soviet intelligence with useful operational intelligence, but not with strategic secrets of major significance. Others maintained that any compromise of embassy security was serious regardless of what specific information was obtained, as it demonstrated vulnerabilities that could be exploited in other ways. Clayton Lonetree largely disappeared from public attention after his release from prison. He gave a handful of interviews in the late 1990s and early 2000s, mostly to researchers studying Cold War espionage or to journalists interested in updates on his life. In these interviews, he consistently expressed remorse for his actions, acknowledged that he had betrayed his duties and his country, and maintained that he had been manipulated through his relationship with Seina, but accepted responsibility for succumbing to that manipulation. He spoke about the difficulty of rebuilding his life after prison, the challenge of finding employment with a felony espionage conviction, and the ongoing struggle with guilt and shame. By the 2000s, Lonetree was living quietly in Minnesota, working in construction and largely staying out of public view. He had remarried, though he kept his personal life private. According to people who encountered him, he was soft-spoken, polite, and reluctant to discuss his past. Those who knew his history described him as someone carrying a permanent weight, not dramatic or theatrical in his guilt, but simply bearing the knowledge of what he had done and what it had cost. His mother, Sally Tsosi, died in 2002 at the age of 67. According to family members, she never fully recovered from the shame and heartbreak of her son's conviction. In her final years, she struggled with health problems that some relatives attributed to the stress of the previous decades. Clayton attended her funeral on the Navajo reservation, where some community members welcomed him while others kept their distance. The mixed reception illustrated the complicated legacy of his case, sympathy for a young man who had been manipulated coexisting with anger about the dishonor he had brought to his community. The broader question raised by the Lonetree case concerns the intersection of individual responsibility and systemic failure. Clayton Lonetree made choices to cooperate with Soviet intelligence. He violated his oath, betrayed his country, and compromised security. Those actions warranted punishment, and he received it. But he was also 23 years old when recruited, isolated and lonely in Moscow, targeted by professionals who understood exactly how to exploit his vulnerabilities, and operating within a system that placed extraordinary responsibilities on very young people without adequate support or oversight. The Marine Corps and the State Department shared responsibility for creating conditions in which such a compromise became possible, even if Lonetree alone bore legal culpability for his choices. The Cold War context is essential to understanding the case fully. In the geopolitical competition between the United States and Soviet Union, intelligence collection was viewed as both necessary and honorable when conducted by one's own side, but as treasonous and despicable when conducted by the other. The Soviet intelligence officers who recruited Lonetree, Yefimov, and Bezverkov were doing their jobs, recruiting sources, collecting intelligence, advancing their country's interests. Those officers would have been praised and possibly promoted by their superiors for successfully recruiting an American Marine Guard. From the Soviet perspective, they were patriots doing important work. From the American perspective, they were enemies corrupting and destroying a young American serviceman. This moral relativism does not excuse Lonetree's actions, but it does contextualize them within a system where both sides engaged in similar activities and rationalized them as necessary for national security. The human cost of espionage cases extends in concentric circles far beyond the individual spy. Lonetree himself paid with 9 years of freedom and a permanently damaged life. His mother bore shame and heartbreak for the rest of her life. Other Marines who served with him faced suspicion and enhanced scrutiny. The broader Marine Corps suffered a blow to its reputation and pride. American diplomatic security was called into question. Relations with allies were strained. And somewhere, perhaps, a woman named Violetta Seina, if that was her real name, lived with whatever memories or regrets she carried from the role she played in the operation. In 2009, Lonetree gave one of his few extended interviews to a researcher studying Cold War espionage cases. He was 48 years old at the time, working in construction, living alone. When asked about his motivations for committing espionage, he gave answers similar to those he had provided during his trial and earlier interviews, a mixture of loneliness, genuine feelings for Violetta Seina, naivete about what he was really doing, and the gradual entrapment that made it impossible to extricate himself once he had begun cooperating. But he also reflected on the lasting consequences in ways he perhaps couldn't have articulated as a younger man. "I was 23 years old," he said. "I thought I was in love. I thought I could manage the situation without really hurting anything. I was wrong about everything. And now I'm 48, and I've spent half my life dealing with the consequences of choices I made when I was barely an adult. I can't undo what I did. I can't get back the years I spent in prison or repair the damage to my family or restore the trust I violated. All I can do is try to live the rest of my life in a way that maybe makes some small amends, though I don't know if that's really possible." The reforms implemented after the Lonetree case, enhanced screening, better training, improved support systems, stricter oversight, made similar compromises less likely, but not impossible. Human beings remain vulnerable to manipulation regardless of how much training they receive. Loneliness, desire for connection, ideological conviction, financial pressure, ego, and simple bad judgment will always create opportunities for intelligence services to recruit sources. The difference is that the systems surrounding individuals can either exacerbate or mitigate those vulnerabilities. The Lonetree case revealed that the systems in place during the mid-1980s were inadequate. Young Marines were being sent into hostile intelligence environments without sufficient preparation, supervision. or support. The assumption that simply warning them about threats and demanding perfect behavior would protect against compromise proved dangerously naive. The reforms that followed recognized that security cannot rest solely on individual willpower, but requires systemic safeguards that account for human nature and human vulnerabilities. Whether the military justice system's treatment of Lonetree was appropriate remains debatable. He received a harsh sentence, 25 years reduced from 30, but served only 9 before parole. He was neither treated with unusual leniency nor unusual severity compared to other espionage cases from the same period. His cooperation with investigators, his genuine remorse, and his young age at the time of recruitment were balanced against the seriousness of his offense and the need for deterrence. The system functioned as designed, producing a sentence that fell within the range of what military justice considered appropriate for espionage committed under these circumstances. From a purely legal perspective, justice was served. From a human perspective, the situation was more complicated. Lonetree destroyed his own future and caused significant damage to national security, but he did so as a very young man who was expertly manipulated and who lacked the maturity and judgment to resist. He paid a heavy price, and whether that price was exactly right, too much or too little, depends on one's philosophy about punishment, rehabilitation, and accountability. What remains clear is the enduring lesson of the case. Espionage is not an abstract geopolitical game, but a human activity with human consequences. Behind every intelligence operation are individuals making choices, suffering consequences, and living with outcomes that extend far beyond what they anticipated. The photograph that might exist in some classified archive showing Clayton Lonetree meeting with his Soviet handlers would show an ordinary-looking young man in an unremarkable setting engaged in what appeared to be normal conversation. Nothing in that image would reveal the profound damage being done or the decades of consequences that would follow from those seemingly mundane encounters. Clayton Lonetree was 23 years old when he met Violetta Seina and began the relationship that would lead to his recruitment by Soviet intelligence. He was 25 when he confessed and was arrested. He was 26 when he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was 34 when he was released on parole after serving 9 years. He is now in his 60s, having lived more years after his espionage than he lived before it, and the rest of his life has been defined by choices he made over approximately 18 months in Moscow when he was barely out of his teens.